Well, thank you. So Edison was all about technology, and we've been in demo hell for about 15 minutes. We'll see what happens. Do it. That's blue. Good, it's supposed to be. So here's the question. This is going to be interesting. I'm doing this out of Google Slides. I created it in PowerPoint, and there are things that may get interesting later. We'll see. But that's the question. There was one answer from an eminent historian of technology. That was his conclusion. He's allowed to do that. He was a gray eminence named Mel Kranzberg. Now, Edison, whoop, there we go. The old man, this is him at about 70. He lived from middle of the 19th century, 1847, died in 1931 in West Orange, New Jersey. We have a fan here. And here he is at about 35 when he was at the height of his powers and certainly one of the most famous people in the world. The question about whether the effect of single events on the world is one that historians like to wrestle with. What would the second half of the 20th century been like if Colonel von Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators had killed Hitler in 1844, excuse me, I'm so used to the 19th century, in 1944, quite apart from considerations of the end of the war and the Cold War and the Marshall Plan, the development of nuclear weapons. These are all very large things, but the fact is millions of people would have lived who didn't, and that would have had a fairly profound effect. Now, what if some young thug from Damascus had killed Saul of Tarsus for his purse, or Newton or Napoleon had died young? And these are big things, and frankly, at this point, what if Thomas Edison had never invented anything is almost that big. Before we can really talk about what the world would be like without him, we should talk about what he did, who he was, what he did. So very briefly, I'm going to review his life. Born in 1947, as I said, died at 84 in 1931. Yes, I got that right. He was born in Milan, Ohio. Oh, right, this has a laser. I forgot. This might be his house over here. It's hard to know. This is the year before his father, Sam, uprooted from Canada, settled here. He had been thrown out of Canada for insurrection. Milan was on a canal leading up to the Erie, to Lake Erie. I will have a map up soon. You can see where all these things are. It was a thriving port. It was about 1,600 people, which was not a village. It was a serious town. And you'll see, here's the downtown. And this, didn't mean to do any of that. Here we are. The upstairs here had a telegraph office in 1847. Morse had sent his first signal from Baltimore to Washington in 1844. So 3 years later, out on the lake in Ohio, and here's the telephone pole. Telegraph pole. That's because there was a line going from Cleveland to Sandusky along the lake, and Milan was on the way. So they got an office. His mother was a former school teacher. The house was full of books. Dad was a political activist and a real firebrand. His mom instilled in Mr. Edison a love of reading that he kept his entire life. Edison was the baby, the youngest of 7. The 3 just above him all died young. And he certainly could have. Didn't. But you can imagine how his mother felt about him as the baby. They moved in 1854, when Edison was 7, to Port Huron, which is at the bottom of Lake Huron, which was, as you can, I keep doing that. Let's see if I can. All this is wood, huge piles of lumber. There were a lot of trees, and there was a lot of demand for the wood. He was, at 10, he was neither addled nor dyslexic, although he was undoubtedly bored silly at school. He spent a very brief time in Engel's Academy. Someone drew this much later, where the teacher didn't like him and punished him a great deal for being difficult. When he's 14, now, right, who wouldn't like this 14-year-old boy as your child? Look at him, what a sweetie. He's an entrepreneur like his father. He's working on a train that goes from Port Huron to Detroit, 35, 40 miles. Goes in the morning, comes back at night, spends a day at the library. He sells magazines and candy on the train. He's a candy butcher. He has kids working for him in Port Huron and along the way, selling vegetables, selling magazines. He was a busy fellow. When he was about 12, he started to go deaf pretty quickly. Maybe scarlet fever, that could have killed him, it didn't. Maybe it was an accident. It's not really clear what did it, but he went deaf at about 12 and once said he hadn't heard a bird sing since he was 12 years old. He could barely hear. People had to shout into his ear. And that was a certain advantage when he wanted to concentrate on something. Didn't hear anything. I'm not going to make any jokes about marriage or anything like that. I promise. His lack of schooling was not unusual. He lived on the frontier. Most people had none. He had his mother who taught him a great deal and did a lot of reading. There's Horatio Alger stuff. About this time, he rescues a 2-year-old boy from being run over by a rolling boxcar. And the father, who happened to be the station master at a place in Michigan, taught him telegraphy. They remained friends their entire lives. In Edison's world, the telegraphs and the railroads are the big thing. Railroads are 20 years old. But in 1850, there were actually, you can't really see it on there were 9,000 miles of railroads already. In 1870, it looked like that, and you can see there's the Transcontinental Line finished in 1869, right? Promontory Point in Utah and all that stuff. In 1880, it looked like that. And of course, these are just the major lines. Now, in 1850, when the railroads looked like that, the telegraph looked like that. They grew up together. First of all, if you have a railroad, you want to know where your trains are. It's a good idea because most of the time there was only one track. And if you were a telegraph company, you wanted a place to put your wire that wasn't going to get interfered with, and the railroads had cleared these wonderful straight paths from city to city. So they took advantage of each other, and that worked very well. It's also true that at the time, there's a telegraph office, and I'm sure you have all noticed by now that the operator is female. It says a terminal station, and in smaller places, women, there's no problem having women as telegraphers. Not in the big offices, not in New York, not in Boston, but in places like this. it was an incredibly important thing, as you can imagine, to be connected to the rest of the world. It changed the way people did business. It changed communications and news. It's why the Associated Press came along. Edison took his first job in 1863. He's 16 years old. And he's in Stratford Junction, Canada. And you remember that sweet boy? Well, now he looks like this, right? A little attitude, we all recognize that. Here's the map. Milan is here. Port Huron is up here, and there's Detroit. Right across from Port Huron is a place in Canada called Sarnia. There's Stratford Junction, where he went at 16. Then he came back, went to just outside Adrian, Michigan, and Fort Wayne, Indianapolis. And he got to Cincinnati in about 1866. Okay, the Civil War has just ended. He has had first-hand experience with the importance of the telegraph and the railroad. He hung out with journalists when he had some time off. He learned about politics. He learned about the world. He had to write very fast and very clearly because he was a very good receiver. He was not a really fast transmitter. He was good, but he could receive. Now, the press wire went as fast as 40 words a minute. A word is 5 letters, average, and a letter is 3 characters, 3 signals, average. That's 600 signals a minute. One, right, every 10th of a second. And it's not the way you hear it on movies about the Titanic or anything. It didn't go beep, 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 beep. It went click, click. And it was the difference. The sound, the difference between those 2 clicks was short or long. And that was a dot or a dash. So he's listening. You're listening to these clicks. And you can tell the difference between the click, I have one instrument over here, that it makes when it goes down and when it comes up. And that's how specific this job gets. It was pretty fascinating. When a story came in, when an AP wire story came in, you had to report it to every newspaper in town. There might be 8 of them. So you have 8 layers of paper with thin oiled paper between them, and you have an agate stylus, and you're writing very hard, very fast, and it has to be very clear. Edison had a beautiful, clear handwriting, and fortunately for those of us at the Edison papers, so did most of his friends, because they were telegraphers. So we could read their writing. It's really nice. People doing 18th century stuff, they have no chance. He made a list of books at one point. This first one, Faraday's Researches in Electricity. Faraday was the greatest experimental scientist in the English-speaking world. And when Edison finally purchased a copy, he made notes criticizing the experiments, thinking about them. His entire life, he would deeply investigate anything before attempting an innovation. Within 10 years from this, in 1876, he had a library in Menlo Park at his laboratory, and 10 years after that, this is his library at West Orange. And you can see this, it's open to public viewing, and it's exactly that good. It's 4 walls, 3 stories, bookcases. Yeah, makes you really jealous, and there's only so much you can do. Okay, quickly for the rest of his life. In 68, at 21, after his itinerant years, he landed in Boston. More Horatio Alger stuff, where he comes into the office and everybody there, these sophisticates, you know, Boston, they saw this hick, and they put him on the wire with the fastest guy from New York, just to show him his place. Edison was good. He received, and then he said the guy started abbreviating words, and then he started leaving words out. And finally Edison broke in, and he said, hey, why don't you send with the other foot? You seem tired. You know. So, you know, that made him a good guy, and now he was welcome in the office, and everybody had a great time. He went to New York the next year, 1869. This is what the skies looked like. In 1888, there was a terrible blizzard. All those wires came down. They had to reconnect them all, or they had to restring them all from one end to the other, because they're not labeled. You can't tell. They're just wires. And in fact, when Edison got there, wires were just bare iron wire. They hadn't figured out how to hard draw copper yet, so it would sag and break. And insulation wasn't there yet. So when there was heavy wind and there was a tremendous amount of rain, everything went haywire. It was tough. The stock ticker had just been invented. When Edison got there in '69, he would make some improvements, but he didn't invent it. He started a telegraph engineering company with 2 partners. And in 1870, the next year, he set up his first shop in Newark. He's 23. The next year, 24, he marries Mary Stilwell, who is 16. But it's okay. In Menlo Park, he went to Menlo Park in 1876. He's 29. New York City again. Then his wife died in 1884, which was pretty devastating. He did love her. He's 37, he has 3 kids. Marion, whose nickname was Dot. Thomas Jr., whose nickname was Dash. And William, who didn't have a nickname because he ran out. 2 years later, he remarried Mina Miller, very different. There's so many stories I'm not going to tell, but she was one of them. He's 39, she's 20. And his oldest child, Marion, the daughter, is 13. So that was fun. And in fact, it was fun for the rest of their lives. It was not fun at all. It was very hard. They too had 3 children, Madeline, Charles, and Theodore. We will see Charles and Theodore again. We will not see William and Tom Jr. again. The next year, the year after he got married, in '87, he set up his West Orange laboratory where that beautiful library was. And TAE Incorporated was 1911 when he's 64, and he dies at 84 in 31. Now, let's back up. This is an actual news clipping from the Louisville, Kentucky Daily Journal on the 2nd of August, 1866. Edison's 19. He's been on the road for 3 years as a telegrapher. He's a very good telegrapher. For South America, E.A. Edison, because they got his name wrong, and J.C. Curran, formerly of the Western Union Telegraph Company in this city, started yesterday for South America by way of Nashville and New Orleans. Their exact destination is not known, but they expect to join someone of the various telegraph corps in Brazil or Rio de Janeiro. Success to the young adventurers. I mean, every day was a slow news day. You put whatever you could in the paper. Now on Monday, the 30th of July, the day before Edison left Louisville, New Orleans suffered a racial massacre. An event with causes that ranged from local demagoguery to Reconstruction, post-Civil War politics. When Edison arrived there with his 2 companions, he found that his ship to Brazil had been commandeered for martial law, so they couldn't go anywhere. And after a day or 2, he decided to go home to Port Huron, so he did. Shortly afterward, he returned to Louisville and he resumed the career that would make him Thomas Edison. He heard at some point that his fellow adventurers had died of yellow fever in Veracruz, Mexico. Now, it takes very little to send young Edison with them. Suppose he'd left Louisville a week earlier, or that the convention that precipitated the New Orleans murders had been a week later. Our hero could have sailed to his death, or perhaps to a career as the owner of Little Al's, a tavern in Veracruz where the drinks were mixed and poured by cute little machines. And it's hard to know. Now, there was, by Edison's own account, another brush with death about the same time, involving his deafness, a box of bound copies of the North American Review he was carrying, a dark night, and a suspicious policeman with an itchy trigger finger. But for the purposes of this talk, one death will suffice. How might Edison's absence have affected American and even Western technology and culture? Now, the living Edison made his mark in telegraphy, telephony, electric light and power, sound recording, motion pictures, iron mining, cement preparation, storage batteries, and several other areas. How different might they have been without him? Well, how different was Edison himself from the other inventors of the time? If the label genius means anything, he was, by all accounts and metrics, an inventive genius. His output was frightening. It was prodigious. He had 1,093 U.S. patents himself. This is his second phonograph patent. This is the application approved and granted the seal. This is the printed version of it. And this is his output. You will see that in 1883, he had 106 successful patents. It's about one every 3 days. And he was a busy fellow. He rarely developed anything utterly new, completely out of the blue. What he did was he tackled problems that others were working on, but his tremendous energy and remarkable ability to develop solutions led to singular achievements. He did what everyone else was doing, but he did it faster, more thoroughly, and more often. He was Leonardo. He was Mozart to Salieri. He was Picasso to Braque. He was Einstein to Poincaré and Lorentz and Mach. He was Robin Williams. He was Michael Jordan. There were many other fine contemporary inventors, but a century and a half later, you've never heard of. You know Edison's name. Most important, at Menlo Park. Now, here we have, this is the New York area, here's Manhattan. Newark is over here, and that's where he went to set up his first shop. Then Menlo Park, where he moved, is down here on this railroad line that runs down to Philadelphia. And 10 years later, he would set up in West Orange, also on a railroad line closer to New York. Of course, to get down to Menlo Park, you had to ferry across the Hudson. There were no tunnels. You took a ferry, and then you got on a train, and you went wherever you were headed west of there. Here's his first big laboratory at Menlo Park. Menlo Park was a failed real estate development. He bought a house or two, one for himself. He set up a boarding house for his workers, and he built all this. This is the main laboratory. This is his office and library. And this is a later electric train that just happens to be there. He knew From the beginning of his career as an inventor in Boston in 1868, when he was 21 years old, he knew that he could accomplish far more if he assembled a team that included co-experimenters to work with him at the bench and machinists to make and modify and refine his inventions. Alexander Graham Bell in Boston had to take his ideas to Charles Williams' shop and say, I need this, and they'd make it for him by Friday. Edison turned to his fellow Cruzy and said, what do you think? Let's do this. And Cruzy would say, how about a second one that looks like this? And he'd say, great. And 2 hours later, he'd be working with it. And that was part of his genius, his appreciation, the need for that. He started building his team in the early 70s. When he moved to Menlo Park in 76, he took a small but extremely talented group with him, and his father up here, who helped him with organization. He helped them with looking for a location to put this laboratory. But this is his initial crew. This is the machine shop downstairs in that long 2-story building. If you've never seen a 19th century machine shop, it's spectacular. But you can see these belts. All the power comes from steam engines. It's transmitted along the roof. And then these belts bring it down, because there are no small electric engines. These belts bring it down, and they had very clever clutches and all kinds of devices. Oh, I didn't get to the upstairs. Here we are. Here's Edison right in the middle. Here. This fellow over here is James Mackenzie, father of the little boy from Michigan. And the rest of these fellows are part of they're all his team. The organ was a gift. This was taken in 1880, 2 years after the phonograph. So the organ was given to them to test the phonograph, see how it recorded music. And you'll notice there are light bulbs up here. And these were early light bulbs, experimental light bulbs, but he had the place lit by electricity. This development, the Research and Development Laboratory, represents the American, I got this sentence from some formal thing, the American institutionalization of what the philosopher Albert North Whitehead called the greatest invention of the 19th century, the invention of the method of invention. And that's what Edison did. He knew how to do that. In 1876, when he put the laboratory up, he declared that his Menlo Park laboratory would yield a, quote, minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months or so. Pretty bold. In fact, for the next 40 years, that was pretty much his astonishing track record. At the same time, the lab was never a place for everyone to brainstorm and work out ideas. From the laboratory of T.A. Edison, it says. He left about 3,500 notebooks. When he didn't fill them all, his coworkers filled some. But it was a place to work out his ideas, like this one, which is a notebook entry for a printing telegraph up here. Now, if you see that little flyball governor, that will show up on the actual instrument. This is a printing telegraph for business communications, just point to point. It's not the kind of thing you put out over the wires in general. So it's beautiful because it sat on the boss's desk. And it was supposed to be beautiful. And there were a number of these. Other inventors were making them too. And they were all beautiful. They're really gorgeous. As he would say later in a patent interference, I'm not in the habit of asking my assistants for ideas. I generally have all the ideas I want. The difficulty lies in judging which is the best idea to carry out. And when Edison wasn't in the laboratory, things slowed. One of his lieutenants wrote home when the staff was numbering about 18 at Menlo Park. He said, "One thing is quite noticeable here. The work is only a few days behind Mr. Edison. When he's sick, the shop shuts evenings as the work is wanting to keep the men busy." Now, if we look at the sweep of his career, his direct impact grows through the end of the 19th century and then fades over the first 2 decades of the 20th. Although he made his reputation in the business world in the early and mid-1870s, principally improving telegraphic technologies, he also produced such digressions, I love saying this, as the electric pen. Right. You remember there was a time when electric knives, carving knives were a big deal, and some wag marketed an electric fork. You know, you plugged it in and you stuck it in, you know. So when I say the electric pen, I always assume there's a fair amount of curiosity. It was the answer to this question that his lieutenant Charles Batchelor had written in a notebook. Notice it's number 18, a copying press that will take 100 copies and the system. There was no good copying technology short of monks and a scriptorium. There was a very messy chemical process. Nobody wanted to use it. So they came up with this. It's an eccentric motor that vibrates just a little bit and a very sharp stylus. And when you use it, you pierce holes in a piece of wax paper. Then you take the wax paper. This is the battery, by the way, for the motor. You put the piece of paper in this press, you put paper under it, and you roll ink over it. And you have copies. And in fact, it worked. This is a copy from a photograph. It might be his wife, Mary. It might not. This, however, is an invitation to a surprise party for Mary just before they left Newark and moved to Menlo Park. I just love this drawing. This is a copying press. And I'll bet there are a few people in here who remember mimeograph machines that looked a lot like that. Now, it was relatively successful for a few years, and then it faded. People found other ways to make stencils, but without the electric pen, this would not have happened. The electric tattoo needle, patented in 1891, is an electric pen with a little ink reservoir on it. It hasn't changed much, and there are occasional tattoo museums that have electric pens in them because they know where it came from. He also worked without any particular success on an early typewriter. But his absence from that period, from the 70s, the first half of the decade, wouldn't have broadly affected much, because later developments in those areas depended only marginally on his work. Beginning with his move to Menlo Park in '76, though, he's 29, and subsequent work on the telephone, Edison generated ever larger historical waves. It's not that he was getting smarter or more inventive. In fact, his early telegraph work was wildly creative, and he once said that creating a quadruplex telegraph, which sent 2 messages each way at the same time on one wire, was the most difficult mental work he ever did. I mean, that was very important, because if you want to put a wire all the way from New York to Chicago, having 1 wire is bad enough. Having 4 It's a real problem. That's a lot of capital. If you can send more messages on one wire, so much the better. What gave Edison his colossal stature were the physical, financial, and human resources he could bring to bear on an obstacle, which in turn allowed him to tackle huge problems. He invented the well-funded research laboratory, and the ramifications of that organizational advance color everything that happened afterwards, not just in his life, in everybody's life. No one else could have accomplished what he did between 1876 and the turn of the century. In the absence of Edison and his pioneering institution, history would have run a different and very unpredictable course. The Centennial Exposition in 1876 in Philadelphia, the telegraphic and telephonic apparatus of Alexander Graham Bell. Bell exhibited this to the Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro on June 25th, 1876. And unless I have any complete freaks in here, you don't know that that was the same day that General George Custer was massacred out at Little Bighorn. And that's quite a juxtaposition. On the East Coast, this is going on, and out west, on what is still very much a frontier, things are a little wiggy, a little tough. Bell's telephone was transformed. This is Bell's original telephone. Was completely transformed by Edison, who was working for Western Union. They'd had an offer to buy the telephone. They said, nah. But when they realized there was a lot of money behind it and it was going to be something, they got Edison, who was working for them on a lot of things. Bell's transmitter was inadequate at any significant distance. Edison and his associates spent more than a year of intensive labor inventing, creating a really superior transmitter. Hacking it is what they did in the best tradition of dogged persistence and 110-hour weeks. They just worked at it and worked at it and worked at it. His transmitter remained the standard for almost a century. Remember phones where you could unscrew the mouthpiece, and inside the mouthpiece was this round thing that was Edison's transmitter. For almost 100 years, that remained the standard. Entirely different principle from Bell's. Other inventors had realized the principle at about the same time, but they couldn't possibly, nor could anyone else, have been able to devote the time and resources necessary to create a commercially practical transmitter. It's one thing to have an idea, and quite another to make it work in the real world for a proper price. All these things are important. Edison's research laboratory gave him an opportunity no one else had. Without it, the telephone would have had difficulty in cities where it would have had a lot of interference from telegraph lines, inductive interference, and in rural areas where it couldn't transmit far enough to be useful. Perhaps a wholly different solution might have emerged, or perhaps the Bell Company would have been able to stifle competition, and the public would have been saddled for a decade or longer with an instrument that worked very poorly. But worst of all would have been the effect on our language, because Bell wanted to use ahoy as a greeting on the telephone. Edison and his crew invented hello. The word was in the language. It was certainly in British English. and it was creeping into American English. It shows up in Tom Sawyer in 1874, a couple of years earlier. But I think it was the presence of a man named Charles Batchelor in Edison's crew who was British and who would shout, "Hello, hello, do you get it?" into the telephone. I think that's what did it, because for the Brits, hello is just kind of an exclamation. Now, most people today associate Edison first and foremost with incandescent electric lighting. With no Edison, development of the light would have been considerably slower, but we would still have electrical illumination to help us read the television program guide. A number of other experimenters were working on an incandescent light in the late 70s and 80s, early 80s, and sooner or later someone would have arrived at Edison's crucial insights about parallel circuitry and a high resistance filament. But no other experimenters had the resources Edison commanded or his understandings of the many problems to be solved in creating a practical electrical system. You had to invent workable lamps, sockets, switches, fuses, meters, distribution boxes, dynamos, to say nothing of designing their manufacture. This is a new vacuum pump he had to develop because existing pumps were inadequate and he needed a better vacuum in his bulbs. The bulbs are up here, and you pour mercury through all these tubes. Then you collect it in the bottom, except for the part that spills out all over the floor. One of our offices was in his laboratory, and one day mercury started dripping through the ceiling, and that was a nightmare every way you can imagine. But it's because you can't pick up mercury, right? Especially a floor that's not nice and absolutely smooth linoleum. It's grooved, it has tongue and groove, it's got all kinds of decorations, and it seeped through the floor into the ceiling and then dripped onto someone's head. Yeah, that was bad. Probably within a decade or so, one other firm, maybe a German firm or some of Edison's American competition, would have put the necessary insights together. But the delay would have altered so much that it's hard to know where to start. The changes enabled and encouraged by the distribution of electric light and power were vast and innumerable. For one thing, many other great electrical inventors of the time, both in America and overseas, were inspired by Edison's work and nurtured in his laboratories and factories. Nikola Tesla, the inventor of the first practical AC motor, at every paragraph here I'm urging myself to go off and tell stories. I'm not going to do it. He came to America to work in an Edison machine shop after working in an Edison machine shop in Paris. Had Edison not lived and Tesla stayed in Europe, his talents might have expressed themselves very differently. A man named Frank Sprague, who worked in Edison's, worked with Edison at, well, not in Menlo Park, but in one of his shops. He installed the first successful electric streetcars. They were in Richmond, Virginia. Radio inventor named Reginald Fessenden served a very deliberate apprenticeship in various Edison enterprises, including the stretch at the West Orange Laboratory with Edison himself. Henry Ford worked at Detroit Edison and was encouraged, he said in a conversation with Edison, to go ahead with his ideas for a production line. George Westinghouse, who had made his money in railroad air brakes, would have had no real goad to promote the development of alternating current in the 1880s, and the power of Niagara Falls, which was harnessed in 95, would not have been harnessed until well into the 20th century. Moreover, just as computer science has infected higher education now, electric light and power was the driving force behind the explosive development of engineering education in the 1880s, and similarly behind the rise of academic physics from a minor discipline that really wasn't worth a lot to the most lavishly funded, best equipped laboratory science in higher education. Without the impetus of Edison's incandescent lighting and the distribution of power, the growth of academic science in the US would have been far different. And so perhaps the balance of intellectual and industrial power it's not this century anymore, in the 20th century. What Edison brought to electric lighting, as to nearly every subject he touched, was the breadth and depth of his team and the agility of his mind, all of which allowed him to accomplish a great deal in a short time. What he also had, which no one else had, was access to the deep pockets of the New York financial community. Developing the lamp, generators, and the many details of the distribution system required sums of money no other inventor could muster in 1878. Venture capital that Edison had at his disposal after a decade of telegraph invention, and most recently, the spontaneous wizardry of the phonograph. The 1877 tinfoil phonograph, one of the very few inventions that came to Edison unbidden. Would anyone else have developed it? It's such a simple device. It's a diaphragm, a round, thin diaphragm with a needle in the middle, an impressionable surface. It's hard to believe that, given its close relationship to the telephone, the phonograph would not have emerged elsewhere. And here is the invention of the phonograph on July 17th, 1877. At the top it says, "Speaking telephone." And it says, "Reproduced slow or fast by a copyist and written down. This can be applied telegraphically thus." And then over here on the right, it says, "Telephone transmitter, same as my talker transmitter." And then it says, "Sheet after received is sent to copyist, who will pass it in machine similar to that shown on other page," which we don't have, "and copied at the rate of 25 words per minute, whereas it was sent at the rate of 100 per minute, because we talk faster than we can write." And the telephone was not made to go into your house. It was made to go into the telegraph office, so that you brought your message in, you handed it to the nice person on the other side of the desk, and they read it. And the person at the other end wrote it down. But the problem is, we talk much faster than we can write. So, what do? You record it, and then you play it back at your leisure. This is an old telegraph technology that he'd played with 10 years before, when he couldn't keep up with the message coming in on the wire. So he recorded it and then ran it through a second receiver that played it back more slowly so he could hear it and he could get better. Now, of course, nobody had any idea what something would sound like if you played it back slowly, but we'll get to that. The next morning, he writes at the bottom of a full page, "Just tried experiment with a diaphragm having an embossing point and held against paraffin paper, moving rapidly. Speaking vibrations are indented nicely, and there is no doubt that I shall be able to store up and reproduce automatically at any future time the human voice perfectly." They had worked all night looking at what they had done and realized finally they had recorded speech. That's not what they set out to do. Yes, they were recording speech so they could play it back, but they weren't thinking they were actually recording speech. I will say here, although they didn't realize this now, but this was the first time in the history of the world that anyone had ever recorded something in real time. They had photographs, they had paintings, they could write things down, but nobody had ever recorded something and played it back. We're so used to that, it's so much a part of our world that it's hard, I think actually impossible, to get away from it. We think that anything is accessible almost, right? Hi. It had never been done before, and people really took a while to adjust to it. People wrote all kinds of stories. The newspapers were full of stories, but Edison and his crew were working flat out on the telephone through the summer and fall, and then in early December, they made this instrument. And on the 7th, they took it into the New York offices of Scientific American with a pre-recorded foil that spoke to the astonished staff. Scientific American published a report 2 weeks later. It says, Mr. Thomas A. Edison recently came into this office, placed a little machine on our desk, turned a crank, and the machine inquired as to our health, asked how we liked the phonograph, informed us that it was very well, and bid us a cordial good night. The story is that they had to play this again and again, and they almost collapsed the floor of the place. People were coming in from everywhere. What did it actually sound like? I hope this is going to work. I don't know if it's going to work on Google Docs, but I had the opportunity, the privilege of recording on this machine down at the Smithsonian. And come on, guys. Can you do it? I don't think so. It sounds a little better than you think. It sounds like what you think scratchy old records on the radio sound like. You had to scream into it pretty much to make the indentations. I'm really sorry. I do have that on my machine, and maybe afterwards I can play it. It's the kind of invention that could have occurred independently the next day, the next year, or 15 years later. It just came out of nowhere. In France, a man named Scott had recorded sound vibrations with a diaphragm and a long, long needle that scratched these vibrations on the smoked glass. So you could see sound waves. But of course you couldn't play them back. Now in 1908, some clever folks with lasers did. And someone is singing Clair de Lune, but that's another story. At 30, Edison became a cultural icon. People wrote, right? This is 1878, first year of the phonograph, and we have the song of Mr. Phonograph. He presented the phonograph to Congress, and Matthew Brady, the Civil War photographer who was probably the most famous photographer in America, had him sit for a proper portrait. He was declared the Wizard of Menlo Park. Here he is. He's actually searching for platinum for his electric light, but it's all about the phonograph, which is down here. all of a sudden he was an international celebrity. Now, perhaps Bell or a Frenchman named Charles Cross would have stumbled on the notion as Edison did, or maybe it would have been some otherwise unheralded inventor. The British scientist Thomas Huxley reacted to Charles Darwin's fundamental insight of natural selection by saying, "How perfectly stupid of me not to have thought of that." And in fact, soon after learning of the phonograph, Bell wrote in a letter, "It is the most astonishing thing to me that I could have let this invention slip through my fingers." Now, the phonograph also gave Edison and his boys a chance to play. Edison is so audacious that he dared to invent an improvement on a poem that Sarah Hale had written in 1830, a poem he used to test his favorite invention. "Mary had a little lamb. It jumped up to the sky, and when it came back to the ground, it said, 'How's that for high?'" Which in 1876 meant, "Cool, huh?" Yeah. When they worked late into the night, they'd been up a long time. "Mary has a new sheath dress. It is too tight by half. Who gives a damn for Mary's lamb when we can see her calf?" Watch out for these guys. They're pretty racy. Now, even if someone had invented it then or later, talking metal foil is a curiosity. It's not a practical success. Edison could imagine any number of practical uses, from entertainment to legal depositions for recorded sound. But it took the focused work of the Edison enterprise a decade later at his new, much larger West Orange facility. And this is now the Edison National Historic Site in beautiful West Orange. It took this place and the staff there to really turn this into a working commercial proposition. This is his, by the way, his new grand home up there that he bought fire sale because some guy went bankrupt, as I recall. He eventually would make a talking doll. There's a little tiny phonograph that goes in the back. And this, if you can see it, is a record. It looks like a hoop. It's not very long. It didn't say much. But at this, no other inventor could have done this. Certainly not as fast as he did. The motor and the recording material, the surface of the cylinder, was incredibly difficult. There was a lot of competition with recorded sound. Records in your home cost 50 cents. And there was plenty of competition. His work defined and battled for supremacy in this brand new arena of consumer entertainment. Someone said that the phonograph saved countless young women from having to learn the piano, and countless guests from having to listen to the ones who weren't very good. But that was your entertainment. You had a piano in the parlor, and the daughters played it. In the 20th century, this laboratory grew to this. And because I know you're wondering, that is the laboratory that you saw a moment ago from across the street here. Most of these buildings are gone now, but they're manufacturing and experimental laboratories, parts of TAE Incorporated. And that was not the only thing they were taking on at the end of the 80s. Before the laboratory even opened, he drew up a 5-page list of things doing and to be done. And this is everything from a cotton picker, here, a new phonograph, a deaf apparatus, an electrical piano, long-distance telephone transmitter, a motograph, artificial cable that's for sending under the, for testing things under the ocean, everything. Whatever he could think of, he'd write it down and then they'd review it and think about it. Before encounters with a couple of photographers, Edward Muybridge, who took those pictures of Leland Stanford's horses galloping and established that they actually get all 4 feet off the ground, and a Frenchman named Etienne Jules Marey, at the end of the 80s, piqued Edison's interest in the possibility of moving pictures, of, as he said, doing for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear. And on this cylinder, where those dotted lines are, you have a film wrapped around here with little tiny images. And as you crank the thing, you see a motion picture. That was his idea. That was the first way he went for it. At the West Orange Laboratory, he built this. This is the Black Maria. It's a tar paper shack. It's on wheels, so it can be turned, and it faces the sun. This roof is pulled open to here, and the sun shines in against a black background where you take pictures of people who are usually wearing white. The film was only so-so, and they were working on that too. But they did make some classic films. This one, The Sneeze, was so successful that they made a sequel, Sneeze 2. This is John Ott, one of his co-workers. For 25 years, Edison and his production company were at the center of American movie making. He was hardly alone, but the camera and the production organization he developed at West Orange were industry leaders. The Sprocket Hold 35mm film that he and his crew developed with George Eastman is exactly the same film you saw all your lives until you bought a digital camera. A film historian has observed that without Edison, we would still have motion pictures, but they probably would have been an English or French invention, not an American one. The beginnings of motion pictures would have occurred later, and the technology been somewhat different. Rather than embracing America's vibrant popular culture, the first movies might have been more elitist and genteel. Now, the subtle cultural effects of that last development are interesting to think about. Rather than Errol Flynn, would Americans have seen more thoughtful, complex characters? The French spy, Jacques Bond, or the English adventurer archaeologist, Northumberland Jones. Who knows? Even more subtle, if Lumiere inventions had led the way internationally, would we be watching cine or Loomies instead of movies today? Just little things. Now, motion pictures were Edison's last great culturally formative enterprise, although by no means his last great venture. At the same time that he launched into motion pictures, he undertook iron mining in northern New Jersey. An expensive failure by the end of the 1890s, the project's huge machinery became the foundation of a Portland cement company that led the industry. Besides Yankee Stadium, which was built of Edison cement in 1923, perhaps the most public achievement of that enterprise was a series of poured cement houses that Edison built in northern New Jersey. Now here he is with the model. The model still exists. It's in his library. Here are the frames set up to pour the cement. And these are two extant cement houses that Edison built in northern New Jersey. In the 20th century, he also investigated storage batteries and natural substitutes for tropical latex, and he became the head of his eponymous corporate organization, Thomas A. Edison Incorporated. Now, he's just off the screen here. He's the president, he's the chairman of the board. Charles Edison, his son, is the president. Theodore Edison is in charge of engineering. There are all kinds of enterprises in here. He had developed years before, in fact, right after the phonograph made him world famous, he developed his signature over a period of a couple of years, but it really came together in '78, in March. The phonograph was December, and now he thinks, I need a signature. And it went from here to here to here, and in 1900, he finally trademarked it. It hasn't changed much, but that became the trademark for Thomas A. Edison Incorporated. And up here, you can see he put it on records, he put it on bottles of battery oil, whatever they are. You can ask me about that. And he put them on spark plugs. They made spark plugs. None of these was a fundamental development. Although living in a world partly of his own devise, Edison was no longer a primary moving force of that world. And on his death, it was suggested that the electricity in the US be turned off for a minute as a tribute. It was quickly realized that would be impossible. You couldn't do it. Now, you won't notice until I pointed out that these savants, the first one is a guy named Albert Einstein, Professor Albert Einstein, who had a tribute for Edison. Einstein was not a fool. In the classic story, A Sound of Thunder, writer Ray Bradbury probed the question of historical contingency, illustrating the problem with a Cretaceous butterfly crushed underfoot by a careless time traveler. His answer was simple and straightforward. It was consonant with the observation of philosophers from Heraclitus to John Muir that everything is hitched to everything, and disturbing anything more or less disturbs the whole. In trying to gauge the effects of Edison's life, we're confronted by a series of causal cascades. Some, like the path leading to the electric tattoo needle, have no obvious macro-historical consequences. But others, like the creation of the Menlo Park facility, shape so much of what comes afterwards that imagining their absence is really a task for the writers of speculative fiction. Many years ago, I saw a cartoon of Edison showing him at the moment of inspiration for the electric light. It was a wonderful drawing, and it says a lot. In fact, it's so compelling that it's been redone several times, most recently in Scientific American. Right? I will leave you with this, a message about iconography, about language, and about the impact of Thomas Edison. And for anyone wishing to know more, that is the URL for the Edison papers, which is pretty simple, and the best biography of Edison's life. I have a copy of it up here. Thank you. One or two?
With his being deaf, what was used to help him hear when he was doing
The phonograph?
Yeah, no, even before when he was just learning his telegraphic ability.
The noise, the sharp noise from the telegraph sounder, he could hear that. The click, that was enough. Unfortunately for the Edison Recording Company, he decided what was good music. And there are pictures of him actually biting the edge of a piano so that he could hear. He didn't like Rachmaninoff, thought he was a pounder. But it's not that he chose everyone, but his taste shaped a lot. There are pictures of people talking to him. They are leaning over and yelling into his ear. That's the best they could do. Yeah. What?
What happened to Edison's multiple companies over time? Did they disappear when he died, or they incorporated it out of?
You mean like Consolidated Edison and Detroit Edison and right, all those things. A lot of the companies on that big flow chart. Well, Charles died. Charles Edison became governor of New Jersey, and he was also Secretary of the Navy. I don't know what happened to a lot of those smaller companies. I imagine they either fell apart or were absorbed by others, and that's interesting. Obviously, I went right to the easy one, the power companies. They stuck around, and they're, from a business development point of view, the way that they had to set up the first electric light and power stations, the utility companies. Nobody knew. How do you do that? There were a few gas companies around, but here they were coming in, they had all this equipment, they needed to build a building, they had to string wires through everything. There were different models, but there was something called the Edison Power Company, something called the Edison Isolated Lighting Company. The first place they ever put power, this is getting a little off topic, was J.P. Morgan's house in 1880. They put bulbs in it, they put a dynamo in it, a little engine, a steam engine in the basement to run it. And in 1882, they set up in way downtown New York, they set up the first public station called the Pearl Street Station that used everything they had. It used all the dynamos and the fuses and the distribution systems, the meters. You have to be able to measure what you're selling. So they had to have a meter. The first light and power installations were really astonishing. Just the amount of work it took to get them done and the things they had to consider and the problems they had to solve. I could play this. You're not going to have any trouble hearing it. This is a 1903 phonograph, and the records on these are wax. They were called wax cylinders. They look like this, and I have a couple here that you're welcome to come up and play with and look at. But they sound, this is a crank handle. There's no electricity involved. There's a little needle that rests on the surface, and it makes this diaphragm vibrate, and the sound comes out of the horn. He's announcing the song. And I believe, although I've been unable to confirm it, that the expression "put a sock in it" is because that's the only volume control you have, even in German. Right? But this, you have this in your parlor, and you have your company over, and you play all your records, and have a gay old time.